This podcast details true crime cases. It contains adult themes and may contain descriptions of violence. It is not intended for children. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for this special bonus episode of Once Upon a Crime. You know it's a bonus episode because you probably said, hey, why am I getting a new episode of Once Upon a Crime on a Friday? Well, there's a particular reason that I'm very excited about. Before true crime became a thing, those of us who are fascinated by the subject didn't have true crime podcasts, YouTube videos, or television channels and streaming services dedicated to true crime content. We had to consume our true crime the old-fashioned way, through true crime books. Even those weren't the easiest to find when I was a teen and first started searching out true crime stories. You had to sneak them off the bottom shelves of bookstores and libraries. Or in my case, buy them in cheap paperback versions in my local market, displayed on a circular rack near the pantyhose and disposable lighters. True story. Anyway, I've said all that to say this. We are now inundated with true crime content in all the formats I've already listed, and we also have a wealth of new true crime books to choose from. That's a great thing, but as a longtime true crime book reader, I have to be honest. Many of the new true crime books I come across are, well, not the best. So when I discover a compelling true crime story that is thoroughly researched and beautifully written, I'm excited to share it. A new book just out this week is one I thoroughly devoured and haven't stopped thinking about since I turned the last page. A Devil Went Down to Georgia, Race, Power, Privilege, and the Murder of Lita McClinton, written by Deb Miller Landau, is the story of the murder for hire of Lita McClinton Sullivan in 1987. Lita was a beautiful, accomplished woman from a respected Atlanta family. Her interracial marriage to millionaire Jim Sullivan in 1970s Georgia was noteworthy in itself. Their differences fueled their deep attraction for each other in the beginning. She was a college-educated Black debutante from the South. He was a white entrepreneur from working-class Boston, 10 years her senior. They fell in love and soon married. But before long, Lita found herself trapped in a marriage with a controlling man who treated her as a possession. Lita was isolated by her husband as much as by the racist societal attitudes that surrounded her at that time. When Lita filed for divorce from Jim Sullivan a decade later, it would set off a series of events that ended in her violent death and subjected her family to a decades-long search for justice. In 2004, Deb Miller Landau wrote a retrospective on Lita's murder, which was published in the magazine Atlanta and featured in the 2005 edition of Best American Crime Writing. Lita's story stayed with her for decades, and in 2020, she reopened her files and began to write A Devil Went Down to Georgia. I'm pleased to have Deb Miller Landau with me today to talk about her book and the story of Lita's life, death, and search for justice. Deb, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you here. I want to say that I was so excited when your publisher reached out to me. I do get people send me books. I don't do a lot of interviews, and my listeners know this. So this is kind of like a little special bonus episode. I'll do that every once in a while when there's something that comes across, that I really, really enjoyed. And so I was so excited about this. I think I told you in an email, I started reading and I just devoured it. So that is that. So I was like, okay, I definitely have to tell my listeners about this book. But before I get into gushing about the book, I just want to say hello.
Well, hello. I feel very, very honored to be on the podcast today. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. So I got to say the story, of course, is extremely compelling. It's something that I don't think I've ever really heard about before. I know I haven't heard about this case, and I don't know that I've heard a case like this. Now, we have heard of some cases, murder for hire cases and, things that have gone through, hoops in the justice system. But this has a lot more elements to it, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I also want to say that the writing was just wonderful. Like, it was from beginning to end, you really just, got into the story and really got to know the people in the story, which is what I really like when I'm reading something about true crime. We're not just going into what I kind of call the Law and Order, like, what happened, who did it, here's the investigation kind of thing, really kind of getting into the backstories, personalities, and how these two people kind of came together and what, happened in the end. So I just wanted to, give that little bit of a encouragement for my audience. And I talked about it in the intro about, being a big reader of true crime for many, 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 many years, and how there's a lot out there to choose from. So, I really try to find things that I think are going to really resonate with my listeners. And this is definitely one of those.
Oh, Esther, that means the world to me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So, but I will say too, it's also very infuriating, this story in certain, in a lot of aspects. So I want to ask about, so there's so many, like I was saying, elements to this case, but it also is very, and when I say that, I don't want to turn anybody off like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a 500-page book with, because sometimes that can happen, right? When there's so much, but the way that it's written is so concise and so beautifully written that I really think it can be like binge read. I mean, easily in a weekend, right? So I want to thank you for that, first of all, for somebody who likes to read true crime and doesn't have a lot of time anymore as a podcaster. So that was wonderful, just to be able to do that. But I want to ask you first about what compelled you to write this story. I mean, look into the story, right? First of all, the article, which I talked about also in the intro, and then actually decide to write a whole book about this. What were like the main elements that you felt that you wanted to highlight or that were really compelling to you in Lita's story?
Well, thank you again. Also, just to comment on I've had a lot of people say to me, oh, I read the story in 2 days or 4 days or something like that. And it's sort of, on one hand, it's great to hear that it's that gripping, but then you think about all of the work that went into it. It's like, well, maybe you should go back and read it again. But anyway, so as you mentioned, I first got a hold of this story when I was a writer at Atlanta Magazine in Atlanta back in 2004. And at the time, it was actually 17 years after the murder had occurred. So Lita was murdered in 1987. And so it was 17 years later, and still no one had been convicted of murder in her case. And so I got sort of brought in to write a retrospective on the case. And I'm not from Atlanta, so I was sort of coming in with like an outsider's eyes. I hadn't really heard of the case. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I sort of jumped in and was completely immersed in the research and just also all of the things that had happened up to that point, to 17 years later to where we were. So it was a real crash course for me in the case itself. It was a huge story in Atlanta and beyond. And just trying to figure out where we were, how did we get here, and who were the people, and what made this happen, and why was it still sort of this open case?
Right. Yeah, because that's one of the things. It is an older case that happened in 1987, and I tend to go back in time and look for these kind of cases too, because again, we have a whole new population now, right, of people who probably haven't heard of this case, but it was, like you said, a very big story back then. And I want to talk a little bit about the people. I'm going to talk about Jim and Lita, because this is, at the core of this case. I will say just this, and I'm going to let you say whatever you want to say about the people, because you've done so much, you spend so much time basically with them, right? I mean, when you're writing something or researching, it feels like you live with these people for you for years, right? But Jim Sullivan, he's one of those all call characters, even though he's a real person. Like I said, it's just, but they frustrate me, but they also intrigue me at the same time. He is such a flawed human being, and there are so many things that he did were shocking and horrible. It's hard to reckon how he became the person that he became with his background, with the success he had, and both success in love and money, right? So what did you make of him overall first? I want to just, and then we'll get to his, his relationship with Lita.
So Jim was raised in a Catholic home in South Boston and in New England, and sort of humble family. He was always sort of a really smart kid, did really well in school, especially in math, and was just one of these kids who sort of had a lot of ambition from the early years. He met his first wife, Catherine, and she was in the choir at church. And they met when they were 17 and got married in their early 20s and had four children, sort of bam, 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 or one after the other. And he was having a fairly successful, for all intents and purposes, life in Boston. Four young children, was working as an accountant, and I think he just, something in him got itchy, and he wanted a bigger, better life. So when his uncle in Macon, Georgia called and said, I'm looking for a succession plan for my business. Uncle Frank owned a liquor distributorship down in Macon, Georgia, and was looking for somebody. He was childless and wanted somebody to come and take it over. So Jim jumped at the chance, even though his wife had zero desire to move to the middle of Georgia and pull her four kids along there. But they moved there, and Jim ended up, it was a fraught relationship. It didn't work out so well. And just on the brink of when Uncle Frank was about to say, this isn't working, you need to go back to Boston, Uncle Frank died. And at the time, Jim was inherited basically the whole company and became kind of an overnight millionaire. And very soon afterwards, his wife left him and said, I don't want to live in Macon, Georgia, and I don't know who you are anymore. And so that was sort of Jim's big turning point. Suddenly, he just, money came along, and his eyes lit up, and he just sort of broke himself away from the life that he'd led. And then pretty soon afterwards, he ran into Lita McClinton.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because as anybody knows that has been around, anybody who's just got money, inheritance or something, it does change people, right? It's just that's the part to me that was really interesting, because I'm like, he seemed to come from a pretty nice, normal family and all of that, and then we see what he turns into. Let's talk about him and Lita. So what do you think drew Jim Sullivan to Lita, who she seemed to be the polar opposite of him? Can you tell me about a little bit about what made them so different and what you think drew them together?
So Lita was a Black woman who was 25 at the time when she and Jim met, and Jim was 35. So 10-year age difference. Jim was white, Lita was Black. And Lita had grown up in Cascade Heights, which is a sort of affluent West Side neighborhood of Atlanta. And her parents were both extremely successful professionals and surrounded by people who were sort of like-minded, who were doing a lot of really good work in the civil rights movement, who were doctors and lawyers and architects, and who were sort of kind of an upper class of Black folks in Atlanta. So she came from a much more pedigreed background than he did. And when they met in 1976, she was working at a boutique, and he walked in, and Jim was the kind of guy who, if he wanted you to like him, you would like him. I mean, we would probably in today's parlance call what he did with Lita sort of love bombing. Like right away, he was charming, and she showered her with gifts. I mean, she just struck him, and she was a beautiful woman, and also extraordinarily articulate and social, and just somebody who people were really drawn to. And so he met her and just kind of sort of sunk his teeth into her and kind of made it his mission to have her be his. And her parents were sort of mortified. That was the last thing that they wanted for their daughter. Not only was Jim white, but he's from the North. He had this sort of brash personality, was cocky. He seemed completely the opposite of what they wanted for their daughter. But they also knew that, as parents, we know that the more you sort of push back and say no to something, the more, your child is going to dig in and want that thing. So they were really trying to balance that out, hoping that the flame would die out, and it didn't. And Jim and Lita were married at the end of 1976. And you have to remember, this is the time in Georgia where Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws that forbade Black and white couples to be married was just only 10 years repealed at this point. So in the South, it was still not at all a common occurrence to see Black and white couples married, let alone, sort of openly in these kind of circles.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like at first, I just was researching and writing about another man like this, that they can like put themselves out there and be very charming, and people are very swayed by that. So I get that. I know that we see that his personality starts to show, the horns start to show really quickly in his marriage and people around him. But at first, and then of course we'll look at that kind of story and we'll say, well, God, she was educated, she was, this, that, other thing, she was why did she go for this? But again, it's one of those things that a lot of times you don't see coming, especially with somebody who is such a good manipulator that way and can present themselves in a certain way to make it seem like he's great.
Well, Jim
I'm
was a
sure
bit
there
of
were a
a
lot of people like that, right? About him.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I think Jim was a bit of an enigma, because some people described him as brash and annoying and arrogant, and then others describe him as charming and funny and smart. And then at the same time, he had this, incredible wealth windfall, and then at the same time he would be swiping condiments from restaurants and wearing his dead uncle's clothing, and just exercising just extraordinary frugality on the inside, while sort of showing all these trappings of wealth on the outside. So he was just this sort of, conflicted person. And I think probably Lita saw in him the charming, fun side, and thought, this is, she wanted a big life too, and this is a way to do that. And then very quickly, he started really pretty early on bringing Lita into very white spaces. So he lived in Macon, Georgia, which is a conservative Southern town right in the middle of Georgia, and very, very much, 45% of that population there is Black, but very segregated. And suddenly he comes to, not only has he taken over the uncle's business, and he's now, had this sort of gall to bring a Black wife to this area called Shirley Hills, which is an extraordinarily rich white neighborhood in Macon. And, he must have known how difficult that would have been for her. Lita was really, really good at navigating sort of quote unquote white spaces. She and her sister were among the first students to attend St. Pius X Catholic High School. They were there because of their parents. They were sort of, exposed to all of these different kinds of people, and white and Black. So she was able to sort of navigate all of that. But, the fact that he sort of brought her there, it was sort of a first kind of lever, I think, of control, and just to sort of show that, he really didn't want her to work, and wanted her to sort of be the wife of the family. And this is like pre, the real feminist movement, especially in the South, where, sort of the husband got to say how it was going to go. And so she's now living in Macon, Georgia, and trying to navigate all of that while also sort of not working and kind of losing any of the control that she had in terms of, having her own money and having her own freedom, and now sort of going, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into?
Mm-hmm. Because like you said, that dichotomy he had, where he wanted all this money and he liked the way that it looked, he looks like he has got money, big house, nice cars, all these things. But he was very tightly controlled the money with his wife, though. I mean, to the point where it was extreme. So you talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he would, I don't know if it's okay to bounce around, but, after they lived in Macon, he got tired of being in Macon, and decided that he wanted to move to Palm Beach, Florida. And so without telling Lita, he bought a 17,000 square foot mansion on like the mile of the richest people in America. And this is down the road from Mar-a-Lago. They moved there around the same time that Mar-a-Lago was being built. So he buys this big, huge mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, again, moving her to another extraordinarily white place. So at the time, just 0.1% of the population was Black, and likely maids or nannies, live-in maids or nannies. And so, but at the same time, he lived in this opulent, beautiful place, and would, reuse paper towels. He would use the plastic from the dry cleaning to, use the saran wrap in the kitchen. He was driving around in a Rolls Royce and living in this incredibly beautiful house, and yet would sort of chastise Lita for not putting the gas in the cars. And then he would he started it early in Macon to kind of put her on this really, really tight allowance, where she had to kind of, on one hand, they're having these sort of elaborate dinner parties of people that he wanted to impress. And then the next moment, she's got to, scrape for pennies together to go get her hair done or to buy dog food for the dogs. So it was just this real sort of juxtaposition happening, and this real mechanism of control. And so he, would yell at the maids for turning on the air conditioning in the Florida heat. And then he would just keep Lita on this really, really, really tight leash. And so she had to use her sort of own allowance money and to do everything. And then he would leave her with, no gas in the cars. So she would be the one to have to fill them up. And just real sort of, just a super crazy level of control with her around money. And then on the outside, he's living in this extraordinarily wealthy place and trying his darndest to climb the social ladder as convincingly as he could.
Yeah, the one thing that you mentioned about how he, they were in Macon and then they go to this, this place in Florida where it's mostly white. That definitely added a level of control, because he knew, he had to know, unless he was delusional, that it wasn't going to be easy for her there. She was going to be pretty restricted as far as even just her movements, things that she would do, where she would be, accepted or feel comfortable to go to. He took her away from her family, which I think was a big, a big step for her. And I know it was for her family. So there was just all of these elements that we see in any economic status when it has to do with, abusive, domestic relationships, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, when we talk about looking at the story, so that we're talking about a story that happened in 1987, which is, more than 37 years ago. And so why sort of look at it now, and what are we looking at that's different? And just at the time, his mechanisms of control, we didn't call it domestic abuse. I mean, what happened behind closed doors was a private matter. You wouldn't ever sort of, and right now we'd look at all that going on and go like, he's controlling, he's gaslighting, he's doing all of these, really sort of manipulative, controlling things with her. And we would look at that and go, red flag, domestic abuse is happening. But back then, that wasn't the case. Everything was sort of a private matter. And she felt, I think she felt a certain amount of shame for getting herself into that situation and being in that situation. She'd always grown up with having means, and now suddenly she's having to sort of beg to go for lunch with a girlfriend. And so, I think it was so she was sort of quiet about it in the beginning too, because she wanted to make it work. She wanted to, she knew that her family was sort of against her marrying Jim. And so she wanted to prove that she could make it work. And then Jim, I think, was, he told a reporter once that, it was hubris that he married Lita, that he sort of wanted to get away with something. So I think that he liked the attention that being somebody who had the daring to bring a Black wife to a white tie or black tie cocktail party in Palm Beach. I mean, I think he kind of liked that sort of shock value until he started to realize that it was a serious, albatross around his aspirations in Palm Beach.
Mm-hmm. So I said in the intro that this book is about a murder for hire case, which tragically Lita is the victim. Do you think, having what you just said, was this solely about money that he was going to lose in divorce, or do you think it had to do more, like, was there more behind it? Because when you just said that, I thought, what does it look like for him, or if she leaves him? You know what I mean? Like, because he's the successful, whatever, and she's just this basically treated like a possession. And then she's going to leave him. Do you think there was more at play there than just the money, or do you think that was his main reason for doing what he did?
Well, I think Jim didn't want to get divorced again either, because he had this first failed marriage and then didn't, he was a Catholic and didn't want to be divorced, but he also started to realize, like, okay, this isn't working for me. So Lita kind of talked him into buying a condo in Atlanta that that they could go and stay when they went to visit her family. But it was her going to stay more and more often. And so she'd go up and be with her friends and family in Atlanta and then come back down to Florida. And during these times, he sort of picked up where he left off in Macon and started seeing other women. And, one of these trips back, she sort of, I say in the book, it's the bra that broke the camel's back, but she found, women's lingerie in their marital bed and sort of went, I'm done. I have to get out of this. So she packed up a U-Haul. This is almost 10 years after they got married, and packed up a U-Haul and drove to Atlanta and then filed for divorce in Georgia, which to Jim, I think he never really believed that she would do it. And the fact that she did really shocked him. And I think then it started to become very much about money. And he tried very, very, very hard to get the case handled in Florida, because in Georgia you have juries determine the outcome of a divorce, whereas in Florida it would be a judge, and probably a judge more likely to give leniency to a fellow white man than a potential jury of Lita's peers in Atlanta. So they went through an extraordinarily contentious a couple years of divorce battle, and it was costing him a fortune. He'd already met somebody else. He was dating a woman named Suki and wanted very much for the sort of bleeding of his assets to end. And then, it was the day that a judge was to decide on the division of assets before it was going to go to a jury trial in Atlanta, that she got, somebody rang her doorbell at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she looked outside and saw a flower delivery man, a man holding a white box with obviously long stem roses. And she opened the door and he shot her twice. And one bullet missed and one bullet hit her in the skull. And she was rushed to Piedmont Hospital, the hospital she was born, and died within half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that. So when the moment she died, he was a free man. All of his financial troubles went away. He was free to be with Suki. It was just absolutely the solution to his problem.
Right. And the second half of the book goes into the investigation and the attempts to hold him accountable for her murder, which everybody, that was the contention was Jim, he had the most to gain from her murder. Of course, he came out with all kinds of cockamamie theories of why she was killed. But there are lots of twists and turns in just seeking this justice. And so many, it seemed, either missteps or maybe even miscarriages of justice along the way. So Can you tell us your conclusions about why this case took so long to be resolved? There was some, I'm sure there was some main reasons and then also some smaller ones, but what was your conclusion on that?
Yeah, so it's a wild ride what happens from here on out. And that, as you know, in the book, there's just a lot going on. So it's hard to sort of be concise about it. But ultimately, they could not prove, I mean, everyone believed that Jim had something to do with it. He was obviously 600 miles away in Florida at the time, but her family and friends believed that Jim was somehow responsible. And Jim instead sort of pointed to, men that Lita had been dating, even went so far as to claim that her parents had her killed so that they could recoup a life insurance policy. And so just really despicable, behavior from an ex-husband. And at her funeral, which happened just days after her murder, he did not show, he did not send a letter, he did not send condolences. And in fact, the family had to ask his permission to cremate their daughter because they were still technically married at this point, which must have been just horrifying for the family. So everybody sort of believed that Jim had something to do with it. He remained a prime suspect for years and years and years, but they couldn't prove anything. So they didn't have the hitman. They didn't have a weapon. They never recovered a gun at the scene. They never recovered, this is before the federal APHIS fingerprint system was in place. So the fingerprints they collected, they couldn't identify whose they were. And they just sort of had nothing other than this massive amount of motive. And this is before the 1987, this is before cell phones, this is before, internet, this is before federal sort of records are, connected. And so Jim just sort of kept kind of getting away with it and proclaiming his innocence. In the meantime, he went and got married again 8 months after Lita was murdered. He lived an extraordinary, fancy, high-flying life now that he didn't have the financial problems that he had during his divorce. And they could just never tie him to it. And that changed in 1998 when the television show Extra did an episode sort of recounting the scene and kind of a retrospective on the scene. It was now, a 10-year-old, 11-year-old cold case. And a woman in Texas saw the show and said, I know this man. I've seen this man before. My former boyfriend my former boyfriend got an envelope full of money from this guy, Jim Sullivan, 10 years ago. And after that, this sort of chips started falling, and they were able to find the hitman. And just when they arrested the hitman and the hitman sort of gave up Jim, said that Jim hired him to kill Lita, Jim vanished and then became sort of a prime person on the FBI's most wanted list for years to come.
Yeah, it's that was such a interesting part of the book where it's just this, she happens to see this television show and says, wait a minute, I know that person. I know what happened. I heard about this. And then what I really like too is the readers will like this, that way it unfolds. It's just really just that true, like, nose to the grindstone detective work that puts all these people together, which is so, good to see. Of course, we know Jim has money, so he can hire good lawyers and he can, take off out of the country and, all of those things. So of course, this is where it's like, oh gosh,
Well, I think to answer your earlier question too about, why did he get away with it for so long? I mean, the absence of evidence was a struggle, but also, like, we tend to give rich white men the benefit of the doubt in a way that's so far greater than any other part of the population. And also when you have a lot of money, you can afford really good defense attorneys. And so, I believe that everyone's entitled to a defense, but when you have a lot of money, you can get a better defense. And so I think he hired two of the top lawyers in Atlanta, if not the country, to defend him through a series of just incredible court cases. And he kept getting off and skating by. And it really looked like he would get away with this forever.
Right. Yeah, there was that one part where I think it was the new, I think it was the DA that basically announced that, oh, we're getting Jim
Yeah,
Sullivan, and phew, he's gone. And I mean, her parents were like, oh my gosh, why would you do that? Like, this
exactly.
guy can take off, he's got the money to take off. Why would you do that? So again, benefit of the doubt, like, I
Yep.
don't know. And also, it's just the media. It's like trying to get some points, in the media on your record that, yeah, we're just about to get this guy. Oh gosh, like,
Well, and Paul Howard ran, his first term as district attorney. He ran on being tough on crime, and this was one case that he resolved that he would solve. So he was pretty, happy to be close to it, and definitely wanted to sort of pat himself and his
yeah,
teams on the back for but you might as well have just said, like, hey Jim, make a run for it, they're coming for
yeah,
you,
yeah,
because
yeah.
that's
Maybe be
exactly what he did.
a little bit more strategic, maybe.
Right. Right.
How you do
Right.
that. Yeah. So I'll say re-researching this case, because this was your second, time around the bat in much more detail. Was there anything when you re-researched it that surprised you or was highlighted more for you the second time around? I mean, seeing that so much time had passed, that, stood out more to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because sort of the idea that, your listeners are hearing about this book, who the victim is, how she dies, who did it ultimately. And yet still you're going to read the book. And I think there's so many interesting twists and turns and in it that I think that it's okay going in and knowing the story, sort of, or at least knowing parts of the story. At least that's the feedback that I've been getting. And to, like, what was new, it was sort of like everything. And I think that's partially because I'm changed as a researcher and as a writer, and also as somebody who, I started to look into this right when we were in the summer of the pandemic and George Floyd. And
Mm.
suddenly the Black Lives Matter movement was coming to the forefront on the heels, of course, of the Me Too movement and our, experience through that. So it was at a time where the country was really reckoning with a lot of things, and I myself was reckoning with a lot of things. And this story had sort of, you get these stories in your life as a journalist where they just kind of stick with you. And so I'd moved across the country with this box of files. It's always sort of been there. And I started to, during all that sort of reckoning, I started to wonder about the people in the story, and sort of wonder a little bit about the role of race. And so one of the things that I asked pretty much everyone that I interviewed in the writing of the book was, what did race have to do with this? And because when I had been writing about it before, I felt pretty removed from the story because it was so far long afterwards, but also because we were talking about a Black victim, and I didn't know enough about, what her experience would have been like, and I was, I think, too afraid at the time to ask, and so made sort of a lot of assumptions. And then so, going back and asking people that question, and almost every single white person I asked that question to said, well, race didn't really have anything to do with it. And every single Black person to a person said, well, of course race had something to do with it. It always has something to do with it. And I really wanted to understand what that meant in relation to this case. And of course, you know, the fact that they were a wealthy interracial couple is why we're talking about it today. It's compelling, and there's, a hitman, an international manhunt, and all these other things. But the truism is that if it was a poor Black couple or a poor white couple, we probably wouldn't be as interested. And so I just wanted to sort of think about all of that as I wrote the book. And I think that made other people think about it in a different way too. And now that and then the things that we talked about in terms of like domestic abuse, I don't think people were thinking about it or using that sort of language. So I think it's always interesting to go back and look at stories that happened long ago and look at them with this new lens. And that's why I think true crime is such a, important and exciting genre right now, because I think you do have that ability to look back and go like, what really happened here, in a way that maybe you don't when you're so close to it at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, because it gets into the news cycle, and then there's like one way of framing it. It seems that kind of takes over. And
Yes.
then when we revisit it later on, I think that we can kind of take it out of that lens. At least that's what I try to do, because I'm very curious about details and backstories and psychology and motivation and all that stuff. And so it's like, oh, well, wait a minute. This is what kind of jumps out at me. Let me look at it this way and
Mm-hmm.
see if that makes us understand the story a little differently. And
Yeah.
so I think that was part of this story for sure.
Mm-hmm. And not to alienate your male listeners, but I do think that that's kind of a woman thing too, to look at, like, we know the victims of of violent crime as predominantly women. The perpetrators are predominantly men, but the consumers of true crime is like overwhelmingly women. That's probably the majority of your listeners, a lot of people. And I think that there's something to that. One is that, as women, you sort of learn this kind of hypervigilance just to exist in life. And then we have this real deep capability for empathy. And so we want to understand what happened with people, and what, far more interested in the human nature than in the, police procedural parts of it or the crime scene photos. I want to know, well, what happened before, and like what happened after. And I think that that's why we're so compelled to understand and hear these stories, because it tells us something. I think it always tells us something about ourselves at the same time.
Yeah, and it does it in a way, in a context that is not, thank goodness, is not a common thing. It's not something that a lot of us have to deal with, which is, somebody in your family is murdered, or that you're a victim of some kind of violent crime or something like that. So I think that a lot of times, even people that have been victims and survive things try to still understand the experience, because it's just so personal. But it's like, well, wait a minute, somebody else went through this. Like, I wonder if they feel the same way, or this happened to my family member. I wonder how they, process that, or just who these perpetrators are, and how do we keep ourselves, safe from that, or at least aware.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of those things are very, very important to most people, and especially women. So yeah, I 100%, I think you're right. That is one of the reasons that I read so much and look at a lot of these cases. Is it's just endlessly fascinating to me to see something that is not a common experience, and really
Mm-hmm.
try to understand, the psychology and the motivation and just what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I think this book did it beautifully. And as much as there was a lot of different twists and turns, like you said, which I think the readers are really going to enjoy reading about, it is still very cohesive, where you can understand it. It doesn't like, well, wait a minute, let me go back to that page and figure out what happened. It really is. It's like, last question is, will you be my writing coach? Because to be as concise and yet so, so well done, and so, thoroughly researched. The details are there, but it's just so beautifully written that you really just, like I said, devour it. And I am jealous in a good way of that that ability to tell a story like this that way.
Thank you so much. Will you be my podcast coach? If I ever get that.
Well, that's a lot easier, so sure.
I don't think so. I really appreciate all that.
Yeah. So finally, I just want to thank you so much for writing this book, for bringing it, your publisher bringing it to my attention and my listeners' attention, and especially for agreeing to talk to me today. Today is publishing day that I'm actually recording this, and I'm actually going to be getting this out by the end of the week, so people can rush out already and get the book, which is, I think, very exciting. And I just wish you the best of luck. I know it's going to be a wonderful experience. And are you doing readings and things like that, appearances?
Yeah, I'll be in Atlanta for 3 events next week, the 12th, 13th, and 15th in Atlanta. And then I'll be doing a book event in Portland, and we'll be doing several we're putting it all together now. But yeah, it's exciting. I really love talking about it, and I really, really appreciate the work that you do, and the curiosity that you have around these stories is just so awesome. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So they can find out more about you on your website. Can you give us that
Sure, it's
website address?
www.debword.com.
Okay, and the book will be everywhere, correct?
Yeah, it's everywhere in stores as of today, so it's super exciting, and online anywhere. Yep.
And I'll put a link to your information and where they can get the book in our show notes. So you guys definitely go and check that out. I know you're going to love the book. And when you do read it, let me know what you thought, because I'd love to talk about it more.
Awesome. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks so much. And good luck and safe travels.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that bonus episode of Once Upon a Crime. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Deb Miller Landau. The link to purchase her new book, A Devil Went Down to Georgia, Race, Power, Privilege, and the Murder of Lita McClinton, is in the show notes. Or ask for it at your favorite independent bookstore. A new regular episode of Once Upon a Crime will drop as usual on Monday, and I hope you'll join me then. Make sure you're subscribed to Once Upon a Crime in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and until next time, be good to one another.